Hello, I'm Kurt Messick. I am the professor for your medieval philosophy class, and I thank you for your participation in week one and the various responses that you put up, both to the introduction as well as the questions on the board. I've responded to your introductions and will be responding to your substance postings in a very short while. I wanted to direct your attention to a few things coming up for week two, and I will try to post videos up at different points during the class as I'm able to put them up. I have a bit of a frog in my throat today, so I apologize for the way I sound, and I've been recovering from a cold that never seems to want to go away, so I apologize for that too. The medieval period is a fascinating period of study, in part because there's so little material in some parts of the medieval period. We have a tradition in historical studies in the Western world of jumping from the ancient world to the modern times, or at least the sort of early modern times, the Enlightenment and such, in part because of the lack of material that's available about the Middle Ages, especially the early Middle Ages. I wanted to highlight a few resources if you're so inclined to look for things. This book called Barbarians to Angels by Peter Wells is a good book on what sometimes is called, although they're getting away from calling it this, the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages are sometimes called that because we don't have a lot of written material that comes down to us from that time. We know through archaeological reconstructions and increasing evidence that comes from other sources that there are quite a lot of things that happened during that time. But again, a lot of our histories are written to gloss over that period because we're just unsure of a lot of the things. Peter Wells does a good job at bringing some of that to life. Then there is a book by William Chester Jordan called Europe in the High Middle Ages, and I can recommend this text as well. The High Middle Ages are the later period that we'll be discussing in our class, and there's a lot more material there. The High Middle Ages we could call really from the time of Charlemagne forward. The year 800 or so is a good, and he writes a book called The Civilization of the Middle Ages, and he's written other books that are on medieval history, and he does a good job at that as well, but again, he concentrates by and large on the High Middle Ages. So that period from Augustine, which is roughly middle 300s to 400 up to 800, again gets a little less information. And then yet another book that I can highlight is the Cambridge Illustrated History of the Middle Ages. And you can even see here the dates that they are putting there are 950 to 1250. And again, that will be the end of our class. And this is just a representative sample of books that are available out there. There are quite a number of history books that have been written, but as you see just from my little sample here, you're going to find a lot more on the later Middle Ages than on the early Middle Ages. And again, that's in part due to the fact that it's hard to find the material. Also, it's hard to find people who have enough of a background to study these things. Because in order to be a good medievalist, you not only have to have time to study the history, but you need to have languages. You need to have Latin, you need to have German, and not just modern German, but Old German. You need to have Old French. You need to have some of the other languages that were spread around, and most people don't have both the time to master all of those languages and then master history. Our lives just simply aren't that long, which is one of the reasons why medievalists often tend to be very, very specialized, and they'll be specializing in the Germanic medieval period, or the French medieval period, or the Spanish medieval period, or the Italian medieval period. You find medievalists who will really concentrate on something that their linguistic ability gives them the facility to do. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, however, we have a period that overlaps with the fall of the Roman Empire. Late antiquity is a term that's often used to describe this area. And Augustine towers over this time in the West. He doesn't do so in the East, and we can talk a little bit about that more as we go along in the class. He wrote in Latin. Latin was becoming the lingua franca, the primary language throughout all of the the empire and post-imperial areas with regard to institutions that mattered in terms of international relations or cross-border relations. While the Germanic and the Francophone and the Spanish and other peoples were developing their own indigenous variations of the languages that were out there, the official church documents and the official imperial documents would often still be written in Latin. That Latin was supplanting Greek in the West. In the East, Greek would still be the dominant language, both officially and unofficially. Officially, Latin was the dominant language in the West, and Augustine wrote in Latin, which meant he was accessible to most of the people who were literate and most of the people who could read. Augustine wrote a ton of material. There was a person named Isidore of Seville, and Isidore of Seville was a great scholar in the medieval times, and Isidore had this big cabinet with all of the works of Augustine in it. Augustine wrote 700 or more books, and he wrote an inscription at the top of the cabinet that read, "He who claims to have mastered that which is within is a liar." In other words, even back in Isidore's time, they had discovered that no one really becomes the master of Augustine. I wrote a dissertation on Augustine. Others have written dissertations. I have a big book called Augustine Through the Ages, which has literally 1,200 pages, and they're big format pages too. And I like to sort of hold that up when I'm teaching a class and say, this is the Cliff Notes for Augustine. People become specialists in Augustine in particular books within his confessions, or particular political ideas within the City of God, or particular things. So to give 1 week to Augustine in some ways is almost hilarious, although as we sweep through history as quickly as we're doing, we don't have a lot more time to do that. This is a book by James J. O'Donnell, which is a good biography of Augustine. There are others out there too. One is by Gary Wills, which is a pretty good one. There's a book by G.K. Chesterton on Augustine, which is a pretty good one as well. But I think nothing really matches reading Augustine himself. Most people can't read the Latin text anymore, but there are a number of good translations of the Confessions and the City of God and other such texts. The Confessions is one of those top 100 books. Every now and then you may hear lists of the top 100 books that people should read to be educated or to be literate, or 100 books you should read before you graduate from college. The Confessions of Augustine is one of those books that I would always, always, always put on that list. And in particular, if you're going to read it, read the sections, and instead of using the words chapters, he uses the word books. Read books 7 and 8. Because those talk about his conversion, and we have a split conversion story with him. On the one hand, he converts to Christianity, away from the pagan, the Manichaeism, the other kinds of ideas that he was fumbling around with in his earlier days. But on the other hand, in the other book, he describes his conversion to Platonic thinking, actually in specific Neoplatonic thinking, a la Plotinus and other people. So scholars are sort of divided on whether he really converted more to Christianity or more to Plato. And one of the important pieces of this is that because Augustine was the towering figure that he was, Platonic thinking, Neoplatonic thinking, became the standard for the church, certainly the church in the West, for the next 1,000 years, until we come up to the time of Aquinas. So Augustine is really worth getting to know. And I hope you have a good time looking up information about him, reading about him. I do hope you'll take the time to, if not within the context of this class, within the context of your own life and education, to read the Confessions. It's one of those books that I reread every year over and over again. I try to get different translations, but I always find something new and different. And one of the reasons why I learned Latin once upon a time, back in my own dark ages, was so that I could read the Confessions directly. Thank you for your participation in the class, and I hope to get to know more about your thought and thinking.